The Madman's Truth. How long can one's soul survive such spiritual altitudes? Chapter 1. The madman. The bitter cold bit into Friedrich's bones as he trudged through the snowy streets of Turin. A harsh wind whipped his thin overcoat around his slender frame, the fabric doing little to protect him from winter's brutal chill. His eyes were sunken, his face hollow and pale from years of poor health and endless philosophizing. At St. Pietro in Vincoli Church, Friedrich's gaze was drawn to something utterly shocking. A cabman was violently whipping a horse, the poor beast whinnying in agony with each brutal lash. Without a moment's hesitation, Friedrich rushed over and flung his arms around the horse's neck, sheltering it with his body. "You brute! You monster!" he cried at the cabman, tears of rage streaming down his face. "Have you no conscience?"
No merci.
Stunned onlookers gathered around the chaotic scene, staring in bewildered horror at the eccentric philosopher embracing the beaten animal. Friedrich turned his impassioned eyes upon the crowd, his voice reaching a frenzied pitch. "Just look at this poor creature. It has done no wrong, and yet you allow it to be tortured, completely defenseless. The very essence of innocence." He trailed off, suddenly transfixed by the horse's eyes. Those big, mournful eyes that seemed to plead for salvation, for an end to the endless cycle of torment inflicted by humanity. In that moment, something inside Friedrich's brilliant but fragile mind snapped forever. Collapsing to his knees, he threw his arms around the horse's neck once more, sobbing uncontrollably. "I finally understand. We are all trapped in an eternal recurrence, an endless repetition of cruelty and suffering. Oh, you poor creature, what have we done to deserve the horrors of this existence?" The cabman and bystanders stood paralyzed, utterly dumbfounded by Friedrich's display. Had the infamous philosopher finally been driven mad by his own doctrines? Perhaps the unrelenting darkness of his revolutionary ideas had simply become too much for one man to bear. As Friedrich was gently pulled away and led off by concerned authorities, a hush fell over the crowd. Had they just witnessed the breakdown of one of the greatest minds of the age? Or was this merely the next phase of an intellect so advanced, the rest of the world wasn't yet ready for his truths? One thing was certain. On that fateful day in Turin, Friedrich Nietzsche's life had been irrevocably rent asunder. The philosopher would never be the same again. Chapter 2. Descent into the abyss. The asylum's padded walls seemed to close in around Friedrich, suffocating him. He paced the small room restlessly, alternating between bouts of incoherent raving and despondent silence. His brilliant mind had been sundered, a victim of his own incisive philosophies. "God is dead. God remains dead," he muttered feverishly to himself. "We have killed him, you and I." Those searing words from his seminal work, The Gay Science, echoed through Friedrich's tormented psyche. He had prophesied the demise of faith, of moral certainties, yet even he had not foreseen how deeply his ideas would impact his own fragile existence. In lucid moments, memories flickered of his once promising academic career. As a young philologist, his intellect and writings had been celebrated, lauded as the ideological successor to the immortal Schopenhauer. He had been poised to join the elite ranks of German philosophers and forever change the world's understanding of truth, morality, and the meaning of human existence. But at what cost? Friedrich's teachings on eternal recurrence, the Übermensch, and the rejection of Christian values had taken a terrible toll. By shattering the foundations of the old world order, he had effectively cast himself and his devotees into an existential void. "I bring you the madman," he mumbled, recalling another famous passage. "Where is God? I shall tell you. We have killed him, you and I." Friedrich curled up on the floor, rocking back and forth as waves of paranoia and despair washed over him. His revolutionary ideas had been pivotal in dethroning the very notion of God as absolute truth and authority. Yet without that divine touchstone to cling to, what was left? Only an infinite abyss of nihilistic dread. As a once proud member of Prussian society descended further into madness, Friedrich's terrifying epiphany grew clearer. By killing God, he had not freed humanity to realize its full, Übermensch potential. He had simply perpetuated an endless cycle of godless suffering and chaos, and there was no escape. Chapter 3. The solace of music amid the darkness that had consumed his brilliant mind, Friedrich found solace in the tender notes of piano compositions. As his caretakers at the asylum attempted various treatments, from hydropathy to supervised outings, only music could reach the tormented philosopher and provide fleeting moments of peace. On one of his escorted walks through the facility's gardens, Friedrich's eyes locked onto an elderly female patient seated at a piano in a recreation room. Her gnarled hands danced across the keys with surprising elegance, coaxing out the melancholic strains of a Beethoven sonata. He immediately felt drawn to the exquisite melody. Taking a seat across from her, Friedrich closed his eyes and allowed the music to wash over him like a baptismal flow. For those few transcendent minutes, the nihilistic anguish and guilt tormenting his soul lifted. He reconnected with the beauty, truth, and affirmation of life that he had once so fervently championed through his writings. When the final, melting notes dissipated into silence, Friedrich opened his eyes. Tears streamed down his hollow cheeks as he reached out to tenderly grasp the elderly woman's hands. "Wondrous, absolutely wondrous," he whispered in a cracked voice. "Thank you for that gift." The woman peered at him quizzically through her own veil of age-dimmed memories before a gentle smile creased her face. Whatever madness afflicted them both, in that instance they had formed an unspoken bond as two souls united through music's transcendent power. From that day forward, Friedrich eagerly awaited his daily musical reprieves, be they from informal recitals by staffers or fellow residents. He would patiently sit and hungrily consume every crescendo, every emotive expression, finding fleeting solace in the artistic pursuit he had once dismissed as mere aesthetic sophistry. Yet even music's healing touch could not fully penetrate the depths of his torment. The piercing philosophical questions that had shattered his sanity still burned within his core. If God was well and truly dead, what secrets did the composition and mathematics underlying these timeless melodies yet have to reveal? Music provided temporary transport from his existential spiral, but Friedrich knew he could not remain suspended in that peaceful limbo forever. At some point, he would have to confront the truth he had uncovered, or be condemned to eternal purgatory between genius and madness. Chapter 4. The eternal recurrence. As the months passed in the asylum, Friedrich's sharpest writings and notes from his period of prolific genius were gathered and pored over by doctors and scholarly visitors. All searched desperately for clues to decode the riddle of his madness and the revelations that had pushed his mind past the brink. Among these scribbled fragments, one concept continuously resurfaced: the theory of eternal recurrence. This core tenet of Nietzschean thought proposed that the universe and all existence has been recurring, playing out infinitely in an endless cycle across time. For the philosopher, this raised searing questions about morality, free will, and humanity's purpose in such an indifferent, mechanistic cosmos. What if some day or night a demon were to steal after you in your loneliest loneliness and say to you, "This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more," one of Nietzsche's notes read. The greatest weight, as he referred to the emotional burden of realizing this truth. As he lay awake at night in his room, Friedrich's mind turned incessantly to the implications. If eternal recurrence was indeed an immutable fact, then all events in history, both sublime and horrific, were trapped in an endless loop of repetition across the eons. The ancient world's glories, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, but also the Black Plague, the Inquisition, the 30 Years' War. Was there no escape from this eternal cycle of human suffering, violence, and existential dread? Or was there a way to somehow affirm the recurrence, to reframe and elevate one's perspective on existence? This struggle consumed Friedrich during his bouts of semi-lucidity. He fervently scribbled in journals by candlelight, desperate to expand his theory and make sense of it all before the madness descended again. "What if we are not the riding master, but the ridden horse?" one fragmented thought read. While confined to the asylum, removed from society and detached from all his former influences, Friedrich found himself overwhelmed by the cosmic implications of his own ideas. Perhaps he had inadvertently glimpsed at an eternal truth that the human mind simply wasn't meant to comprehend, at least not without shattering under the weight. As word of Nietzsche's profound breakdown spread throughout philosophical circles in Europe, a polarizing debate raged. Was he an unparalleled genius who had lived in truth too painful for the masses? Or was his descent merely the tragic downfall of an arrogant, hubristic mind undone by its own ambitions? For the former philologist, however, the only truth that mattered now was finding an answer to eternal recurrence, to affirm it and wrest some semblance of mortal freedom and purpose from an endlessly repeating existence, or be forever damned in its cycles of pain and nihilistic dread. Chapter 5. The Anguished Prophet. As Friedrich languished in the oppressive confines of the asylum, word of his tragic condition spread like a shockwave through Europe's elite philosophical circles. The once celebrated intellect had inexplicably descended into feverish madness after shattering the bedrock of faith and morality with his iconoclastic ideas. To some acolytes, Nietzsche's breakdown was the inevitable byproduct of his uncompromising pursuit of truth. He had stared into the abyss of meaninglessness without flinching, and in doing so, lost his grip on reality. These devoted disciples spoke in hushed, reverent tones of their anguished prophet, a secular messiah driven mad after glimpsing the harsh, godless cosmos. Our age wills it so, one devout Nietzschean wrote. The free spirits must create new values from the wreckage before all is engulfed in the void. Others were less charitable in their assessments. Detractors dismissed Nietzsche as a self-deluded egomaniac undone by his own unchecked hubris. His screeds rejecting traditional morality, they sneered, were nothing more than the misanthropic railings of an unstable mind. The prophet had exposed himself as a fraud, a madman, plain and simple. He styles himself an immoralist, a repudiator of ethics and civilization, sniffed one academic rival. Little wonder his teachings corrupted his withered soul. In the asylum, news of the furor he had unleashed in the outside world reached Friedrich's ears through staff members and visitors. With each report of the fierce debates raging over his controversial philosophies, a sad smile played across his worn features. So the truth he had sacrificed everything for was finally being embraced, or spurned. "I came too early," he whispered in a rare moment of lucidity. "The minds of this age were too small to contain my ideas. I have been and will remain a fatality." As the philosopher's decline from revolutionary thinker to raving lunatic grew more protracted, one question loomed larger with each passing day. Had his affliction been triggered solely by his merciless confrontation with eternal recurrence, mortality, and the absence of universal truth? Or had the iconoclast irrevocably shattered his own brilliant mind in reshaping humanity's values and understanding of itself? When death eventually came to finally silence Nietzsche, the mystery would endure. Was he the courageous prophet driven mad by the horrifying yet life-affirming revelations he discovered through reason and sheer force of will? Or merely a tragic figure drowned by intellectual arrogance in the depths of his own shadow? The eternal debate would rage on through the decades to come, with each new generation of thinkers obliged to grapple with the searing wisdom and unsettling implications of the madman's ideas. For even a mind as extraordinary as Nietzsche's could only point the way. It was up to the rest of humanity to have the fortitude to follow. Chapter 6. Cracks in the foundation. In the halcyon days before his breakdown, Nietzsche had been continually buoyed by a loyal circle of friends, colleagues, and fellow philosophers. His biting criticism of religious doctrine and traditional morality was matched only by their ardent belief in his groundbreaking ideas and uncompromising pursuit of truth. As reports of his mental unraveling in torrents spread, however, that supportive foundation began to splinter and erode. Where were his fervent defenders now that the avant-garde thinker had been rendered a mere husk, lost in the nihilistic void his radical concepts had unearthed? Among those grappling with doubts was the composer Richard Wagner, long one of Nietzsche's closest confidants. The philosopher had once channeled his reverence for Wagner's sublime music into his seminal work, The Birth of Tragedy, articulating a perception of art as a metaphysical bridge between humanity and the truth of existence. Yet even as Wagner outwardly expressed concern over Nietzsche's tragic plight, privately he grew increasingly troubled by what he perceived as blasphemous undertones in the younger man's recent writings. The brazen denunciation of Christianity in particular struck a nerve for the composer, who drew inspiration from religious parables and Teutonic myths. His ideas outstripped all sense and proportion, plunging him into frenzied confusion. Wagner grimly remarked to an associate, "I feel a good deal of pity for the poor friend, but also a shudder at the thought of where such diabolical delusions can lead." Nietzsche's one-time mentor Paul Rie was equally shaken upon receiving word of his unhinged behavior in Italy. As the trio discussed endlessly during their younger days, unflinching scrutiny of societal conventions and values was a noble aim. But Rie wondered whether Nietzsche had passed the point of no return in his single-minded crusade against all certainties and moral anchors for human existence. "We made a mistake in altogether condemning convictions in the way we then did," Rie somberly reflected. "Such complete liberation of the intellect inevitably opens the door to madness." Amid the chorus of rationalizations for Nietzsche's breakdown, perhaps the most poignant came from his longtime admirer, the Danish literary critic George Brandes. In his impassioned essays on the philosopher's trailblazing ideas, Brandes had once hailed him as a spiritual syphilis, a provocative descriptor for one who inoculated society against the conformist disease of mass thinking. This is indeed a disastrous fate, the insanity of the strongest spirit of our age. He mourned of Nietzsche's condition. But could anyone have continued to live spiritually at such altitudes for very long? As one of modernity's most brilliant minds burned itself out in a feverish blaze of madness, cracks continued to form amongst his most ardent defenders. Could Nietzsche's grand intellectual project, stripping away all collective illusion, possibly have been taken too far? Or was the prophet merely the first of many casualties in redefining humanity's pursuit of meaning in a godless universe? Chapter 7. Whispers of the Übermensch. Even as Nietzsche's inner circle fractured over doubts and recriminations, a new generation of free thinkers and self-anointed disciples rallied around the fallen prophet's ethos. To them, the philosopher's descent into apparent madness was simply the inevitable cost of his single-minded quest to obliterate the antiquated values and moral constraints of the masses. Ernst, a young writer who led one such ardent sect of Nietzschean acolytes, saw his mentor's breakdown as the painful birth pangs of the new man. The Übermensch that the philosopher had foreseen transcending conventional human boundaries and ushering in a new era of possibility. He is the first to truly smash all idols, Ernst proclaimed to his fellow disciples, his voice trembling with feverish conviction. Nietzsche's madness signals the death of the old ways, paving the path for us to become the creators of new, incalculable values. Meeting in dimly lit salons across Europe, these self-styled free spirits pored over Nietzsche's writings, seeking to plumb the true meaning behind his cryptic proclamations about eternal recurrence and humanity's unfulfilled potential. Some interpreted his words as a call to unshackle themselves from bourgeois cultural norms through pure ego and pursuit of primal desires. "Why so cowardly, O Zarathustra?" one young disciple wrote in aspiration to embody Nietzsche's fictional prophet. "I say unto you, one must have chaos in one to give birth to a dancing star." Others embraced a more perverse, weaponized vision of the Übermensch ideal. Theirs was a radical personification of the will to power that Nietzsche had espoused. In their view, only by metaphorically killing God and toppling the current decadent order could the superior examples of humanity arise to seize control through sheer force and subjugate the weak for a new societal paradigm. "Forget not, my brothers, the gravest words of the prophet," one anarchist militant invoking Nietzsche's mantras scribbled in a secret manifesto. "There cannot be a loftier aristocracy than that of blood and race." As these zealous interpretations of his life's work gained momentum, what few reports reached the asylum of Nietzsche's true condition only fueled the fires of his most extreme acolytes. They saw his babbling, erratic behavior not as a tragic descent into dementia, but rather the transcendent rantings of a supreme mind liberated from the boundaries of conventional reason. In their eyes, The prophet had ascended to divinity by his own merits, the first true Übermensch, free of moral and rational constraints. That his bold visions and ideas had seemingly shattered his sanity was merely evidence of the extraordinary burden borne by the supermen who dared walk the earth before them. Nietzsche had sought to reimagine humanity's values and purpose through sheer force of will in order to fill the void left by God's demise. Yet as ripples of his radical doctrine began dispersing outward among zealots and social anarchists, one had to wonder, had the prophet failed to anticipate how quickly the foundations he demolished could give way to a new age of dogma and nihilism? Chapter 8. A brilliant flame extinguished as all-consuming madness gradually tightened its grip. Nietzsche's final decades were characterized by a descent into profound dementia and despondency. Those fleeting moments of lucidity became increasingly rare and short-lived. The once fiery intellect that had challenged the world's understanding of truth and morality flickered like a guttering candle's flame, dimming with each passing year. By 1889, the philosopher had stopped penning his provocative aphorisms and musings. He sat for hours in silence, staring blankly out the window of his simple boarding room in Naumburg. When emotion did surface through the haze, it often manifested as abject loneliness and melancholy over his broken mind and inability to continue his life's work. "Have I been understood?" he would murmur plaintively to his sister Elizabeth, one of his few remaining visitors and caretakers. "There is such incomprehensible solitude." On increasingly frequent bad days, however, the darkness descended in the form of wild-eyed outbursts and terrifying delusions. Friedrich raved about being visited by vengeful, demonic dwarves and death spasms of God. He penned frantic letters to former colleagues and even the German Kaiser, warning of imminent cultural catastrophe and sinister conspiracies. "All values are overthrown. There has never been such a monstrous moment," one unhinged dispatch read. "I have called these last 2 years together with a call and an intonation to which the future will hear nothing similar." Elizabeth endured the harshest outpourings of her brother's mental torment, withstanding inexplicable rages and venomous verbal assaults, as his hallucinatory visions transported him to a private purgatory. All she could do was calmly remind Friedrich of who she was and soothe him with one of his favorite piano sonatas by Beethoven or Schumann. "You are with your sister in Naumburg," Elizabeth repeated in a gentle, unruffled cadence during these episodes. "No one is here to harm you, Friedel. You are safe." Those who witnessed Nietzsche in this deteriorated state could scarcely reconcile the incoherent ramblings with the works of piercing brilliance he had produced just years earlier. How could this hollowed shell of a man have elucidated such revolutionary concepts as the death of God, the eternal recurrence, and the Übermensch? Some disciples held out hope that these were but the outer manifestations of an even deeper genius at work, that on some higher plane, Nietzsche had achieved an enlightened form of madness transcending all rational conventions. Most, however, had to simply accept that this tragic diminishment into senility and paranoia was mortality's cruel price for daring to shine such a searing light into the void at the core of existence. When Nietzsche finally met his end in 1900 after a series of strokes, his death went largely unnoticed beyond his small circle of remaining friends and supporters. Yet even as the mortal flame flickered out, the sparks thrown off by his brilliant, uncompromising ideas continued radiating outward, igniting new interpretations and schools of thought among the avant-garde and intelligentsia alike. Whether prophet or simply a disturbed intellectual martyr cast adrift, Nietzsche had forever changed humanity's inner existential reckoning. The question that would echo across generations was, once the depths were illuminated, could we ever return to the old comforting certitudes, or were we forever destined to grapple with the void? Chapter 9. A dangerous awakening in the decades following Nietzsche's death, echoes of his incendiary ideas and uncompromising scrutiny of societal values continued rippling outward in unexpected ways. The self-anointed disciples and free spirits inspired by his writings splintered into increasingly radical subgroups, each claiming their particular interpretation as the true embodiment of the late philosopher's vision. For the far-right Nazis rising to power in Germany, Nietzsche's exhortations about the supremacy of the Übermensch, His concept of a heroic ideal devoid of conventional morality became a dogmatic rallying cry. They twisted his proclamations about aristocratic lords of the earth into a poisonous justification for Aryan superiority and the subjugation of inferior races. In my doctrine of the Superman, there is no avoidance of a dreadful truth. Hitler gleefully paraphrased his ideological inspiration in one hate-filled tirade. Mankind must experience a tremendous upheaval in which today's races will be wiped from the earth or enslaved. The disturbing conflation drew outraged condemnation from Nietzsche's contemporaries and students who knew the truth behind his revolutionary principles. Yet even they struggled to rationalize how the philosopher's noble quest to free humanity from oppressive groupthink and religious dogma had become a malign force weaponized by the fascists. Has there ever been a case of a thinker being so grotesquely misunderstood? Lamented George Brandes, the Danish literary critic. Nietzsche's life was a ceaseless protest against all that is brutal and violent. His was a voice calling for noble dissemination of culture. Meanwhile, the Soviet revolutionaries sweeping into power shared in selectively misinterpreting Nietzsche's ideas to validate their own totalitarian agenda. The notion of smashing old idols and moral conventions aligned neatly with their efforts to rupture social stratification and erect an atheistic workers' state. Nietzsche is no longer considered just some individualistic philosopher, one Politburo ideologue proclaimed. He is the philosopher who proclaimed the will to power as the essence of life. As the 20th century's twin juggernauts of fascism and communism transformed Europe into a charnel house, it grew increasingly evident that the brilliant iconoclast challenge to humanity's belief systems and ethical anchors had unleashed a kind of metaphysical Pandora's box. Freed from those age-old shackles, entire populations now twisted his ideas to justify unspeakable atrocities in the name of ideology, power, and racial supremacy. In tearing down the old idols, Nietzsche had sought to shock humanity awake from its dogmatic slumbers and blaze a trail towards something greater. But in filling that void of nihilistic dread he exposed, the masses were now embracing creeds of hate, oppression, and violence more virulent than anything the decadent old orders could propagate. Perhaps worst of all, some wondered whether the high-minded philosopher's revolutionary concepts had simply revealed an unfortunate truth, that absent universal morals and values, humankind was doomed to regress into its basest, primal urges under the looming shadow of nihilism. As blood flowed across Europe in the thousands of battles waged in the name of radically opposed ideologies, it called into question whether Nietzsche had been dangerously naive about humanity's capability for reason and enlightenment when freed from its ethical fetters. Chapter 10. The Eternal Return in the Ashes of the 20th Century's Civilizational Bloodbath. A new generation began grappling anew with the metaphysical implications of Nietzsche's ideas. As the dust settled from humanity's descent into totalitarian horror and unfathomable violence, they saw not just the dangers of moral relativism, but also glimmers of revelation in the rubble. Some interpreted the unflinching atheist philosopher's quest to redefine truth and values amidst a meaningless, godless void as a prescient glimpse into the enduring struggle of sentient beings to find purpose in an indifferent universe. No longer were his musings seen solely as the province of overeducated academics or extremist radicals, but an existential reckoning all must undertake. Has any other thinker recognized the central drama of our situation with such terrifying grandeur? The eminent scholar Walter Kaufmann reflected in his seminal study of Nietzsche's ideas. The death of God left a cultural void that we have been fortuitously unable to fill. In a post-war world adrift in uncertainty and disillusionment, many existentialist thinkers saw Nietzsche's wrestle with the concepts of free will, eternal recurrence, and finding individual meaning as a blueprint for navigating a new cosmic order. Writers like Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre pondered whether the only rational response upon discovering life's inherent meaninglessness was to willfully create one's own subjective values and authenticity. Freedom is what we do with what is done to us, Sartre wrote, channeling the spirit that animated Nietzsche's Übermensch ideal of human agency over our circumstances. There is no reality except in action. Others expanded these coping philosophies into new schools of individualist thought, objectivism, secular humanism, even modern initiatives to extend human consciousness into a conceptual singularity by technological transcendence. All trace their origins back to the German thinker's crusade to shatter old precepts and provoke humanity into finding new ones tailored for an emerging scientific era. One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. The philosopher's ecstatic words proclaimed from nearly a century earlier. As acolytes and critics alike continued to parse and debate Nietzsche's contradictory utterances, others asked whether he had not gestured towards a far grander truth, a vision of existence as a relentless cycle of creation and destruction playing out across infinite cosmic eons. The same patterns of growth, evolution, and upheaval eternally repeating until intelligent life finally recognized them and embraced the terrifying weightiness of the revelation. In this light, Nietzsche's agonizing confrontation with cosmic insignificance, godlessness, and the death-rebirth cycle of all values was simply part of the same endless recurrence of human drama, epiphany, and downfall. His descent into apparent madness merely foreshadowed the inevitable psychic toll such forbidden truths extracted on those daring to glimpse them. Perhaps the supreme irony was that in smashing the old religious idols and demolishing the certainties of human dominion over Earth, Nietzsche had unwittingly cleared the path for science's unraveling of the sublime mechanics underlying all existence. Uncoded universal patterns and equations rendering our individual struggles for meaning as ultimately insignificant and ephemeral, but at the same time, opening astonishing new vistas into realizing our species' fullest potential. For now, the old existential cycles played out yet again. The philosopher's unsettling yet profound challenges to redefine morality, purpose, and human consciousness endured, awaiting each new generation to wrestle with them anew. As had always been, and would be again, world without end.